Welcome today to today's stream. I really appreciate you coming on. This is the most excited I've been for an interview since I was back from Ukraine, so I'm really excited to talk to somebody who's deeply interested in foreign policy, because in the online streaming politics news space, most of it's domestic news. So getting to concentrate on this is I'm really excited about. So first, could we start off by you introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Matt Duss. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy.
Fantastic. And you used to be the foreign policy advisor for Senator Bernie Sanders. Is that correct?
Yes, I was Senator Sanders' foreign policy advisor from 2017 to 2022.
Can I ask you how you were able to find yourself in that position?
Well, I mean, I came to DC in 2007, originally working in journalism, and moved into the policy space. I was focused on Middle East issues. I worked at a few different organizations, but in 2016, I was the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and just was working with the Bernie campaign at that time, not very closely, just giving them some material when they had reached out. And then after the election, his team reached out to me to see if I wanted to come chat with him about joining his staff. And I did.
Fantastic. Was that the first time you ever advised anybody in federal public office?
Yes, that was the first time I ever worked in government. Yeah, it was not something that I'd planned to do, but the opportunity came, and obviously, when you have a chance to work with someone like Bernie, it's a good one, and it was a great experience. I really loved working with him.
I'd like to move on to the next topic, but Bernie helped get me involved in politics originally, so I did want to ask you one thing about Bernie's foreign policy history.
Sure.
Is there anything about, if you were trying to explain Bernie's foreign policy beliefs to somebody who was unfamiliar or had only heard about his domestic issues, because most people only know about his domestic politics, his stuff about, Medicare for all and domestic issues, how would you try to describe it to somebody who was unfamiliar?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, but I think the answer is pretty easy, as I think his foreign policy reflects the same principles and values that his domestic policy does, which is that we have obligations to each other. We need to build a fairer and more just world, a more equal world, a world where we act and live in solidarity with each other. I think that reflects things like Medicare for all, which is to say we can't afford to provide great health care for every single man, woman, and child in this country. We have the resources, we have the ability. And I think his foreign policy reflects a belief that we have the ability to create a more peaceful, a more just, and more sustainable world.
Do you think if anybody else asked you, your answer might have been different? You might have been like, I don't want to advise this person, or was there anything special about Bernie that made you accept?
Yeah, of course there was. I mean, there's a lot that's special about Bernie. It's like, I think he's a singular figure. I mean, I thought this already in 2016, but even working with him, and again, my experience is I've only ever advised one U.S. senator or one politician, but still, even my experience on the Hill, knowing, I really enjoyed working with other staff, but a lot of staff, they don't agree completely with their bosses. I'm saying, if it's about 80%, 70%, if it's less than that, it becomes very tough to work for someone. But, the bottom line is you're working for them, you're advancing their agenda. And I was just really fortunate to work with someone with whom I agreed, and my views aligned like 99%. And that was a real privilege. And it's also working for someone who had the amount of courage and vision that he had and still has, that I think not a lot of people get to experience that. I make the comparison. I'm a musician. I'm a huge fan of music, and I make the comparison of like it was a chance to like play with one of the greats, to really work with someone who changed the game and I was able to work with him and kind of be part of his band when he was really, and I think he's still at the top of his game. But I was able to play bass in the Sanders band when he was doing some of his best music, I think.
Absolutely. I want to move on. I could talk about this all day and I could gush about it, but I do want to move on to the topic that we want to discuss today. So a big reason what motivated me to reach out to you to have you on is that you actually went to Ukraine before you published your piece in the New Republic, which is what initially moved me towards contacting you. What motivated you to go to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a few things. One is like my father is Ukrainian. So I'm half Ukrainian. My father was born in a refugee camp after World War II. Both of his parents were Ukrainian refugees. So this is just part of who I am, and so it's something I've been, it's obviously a country that's interested me for a long time. I had been there for the first time in 2015. I actually went with my father and my family to visit our family who still lives in Ukraine, part of my family, because my father's family was, split up and separated during the 30s, during the crackdowns, the Holodomor, and then the war. So we still have extended family that lived there. So we went to visit some of them. But then, you know, the war happened. And then I wrote a piece for the New Republic actually last year in June of 2022, just making my case for why supporting the defense of Ukraine was important for the left, like making the left progressive case for why U.S. policy supporting Ukraine's defense against the invasion was just and why it aligned with what I believe are really important progressive principles. And I wanted to write a follow-up for that a year later to see, a year later, how are things going? Have my views changed? But I realized, what I need to do is go to Ukraine and at least spend some time talking to folks and being there, seeing it, smelling it, feeling it. Not that I'm going to get like a deep knowledge of the situation being there for a week, but, or about a week and a half. But I do know, having traveled, having, done some travel to other areas of the world, when you get to a place and you can just kind of feel it, and talk to folks and look them in the eye and just hear them explain their situation to you. I mean, that there's really no substitute for that, and actually just trying to understand what people are experiencing and understanding what the situation was. So, you don't want to overstate how much you can learn, but I did think it was really important to just kind of go and try to share that experience for a little while.
So when you went there and you shared that experience with people and you were talking to people, I don't know, in the street, I don't know what part of Ukraine you were spending most of your time in. I believe in the article, I think it said you were in Kiev for some at some point in time.
Kiev and Odessa. So
Kiev and Odessa.
You traveled to Kiev, was there for a few days, and then took the overnight train to Odessa. Spent a few days in Odessa, and then took the train back to Kiev, and then back out. So it was not a long time, but it was enough time to at least talk to a good range of people, just a number of activists, journalists, Ukrainian and U.S. government folks who were there, some military folks, and just local, just local organizers in Odessa, people who had no involvement in any kind of activism before February of 2022, but who are now very, very engaged in all kinds of grassroots activism and organizing in their communities as a result of the invasion. And so just hearing their perspectives was what I really wanted to go and do.
Something that really, when I went to Ukraine for the first time, which was in May of 2022, I went there and I filmed in Zaporozhye on the forward operating positions with territorial defense at the time, which was trying to hold the front because the Ukrainian army was maneuvering in other areas. Yeah. And something that really surprised me from talking to people out there was this impression that I got, or that was pumped out very regularly from 2014 to 2022, was about this gigantic divide between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. But from my time spending on the front line, and this is the thing that surprised me the most, was everybody I met there was speaking Russian. Everybody in territorial defense fighting against the invasion was speaking Russian. And there didn't seem to be that much of a divide when I was in these communities that were largely being defended by the residents of said communities. And that was something that really shook up my view of the war, which had been affected by, I think, a lot of commentary that could have been coming from sources closer to Russia, or sources that have maybe been tainted by often, I would say, Russian imperial dominated narratives. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because listen, Americans, from our experience, we tend to speak one language. Mm-hmm. A lot of, we have, this continent, this country that's surrounded by two oceans. For a lot of people around the world who live in different situations, knowing just 2 and 3 languages is not uncommon. But especially for a country like Ukraine, like engaging with, and especially as you move further east, but not only in the east, it's just people are raised in a society where both languages are spoken. And I agree. I think you did see some sources that were, I guess, more sympathetic to the Russian point of view, or they're saying, well, these people primarily spoke Russian. I think it's even the president, Zelensky, like, primarily spoke Russian, usually speaks Ukrainian.
You can see his Ukrainian has improved throughout the war, actually.
Right. Right, but that, just the fact that you perhaps grew up first speaking Russian does not make you less Ukrainian. And I think that's really the thing to keep in mind. Language matters. Language just is hugely interrelated with culture, but that's been the reality of Ukraine.
What shocked me a lot, though, is that once that hit me, it was almost felt obvious after it slapped me in the face, because I was thinking, oh, we don't have this type of thinking when it comes to Ireland. Oh, they all speak English. I guess they all want to be part of England. Right. Or, oh, we speak English, so that means we want to be part of England. But we would understand the history between the British and the Irish that led to that linguistic, the linguistic demographic reality of the Isles. Right. But it seems that same context was not as provided, I think, when in commentary leading up to the invasion.
Right, that's right. I mean, because you really do need to spend a little time understanding the kind of relationship, the kind of dominant, the whatever colonial or imperial relationship between Russia and Ukraine that kind of led to this situation.
So would you say, and this was one of the questions I wrote down, I really wanted to ask you, would you consider this a post-colonial war?
I think in some ways it is. Yeah, I mean, Russia, sees itself as the dominant power, and many Ukrainians see themselves as having been dominated. So I think they see this in post-colonial terms. But I think as I wrote in the piece, when Ukrainian representatives and diplomats try to make this case to countries, particularly in Africa and other areas of the global South, they don't find a lot of receptivity to that. Because first of all, because a lot of these countries in the global South, particularly in Africa, they still recognize that the Soviets in some ways were far more supportive of them in resisting kind of Western U.S. domination, and certainly European domination. So when they think colonial and post-colonial, what they remember is we are throwing off the imperialism and the domination of Europe. So there's a bit of resistance to Ukraine coming and saying, well, we want to be closer to Europe. That's why we're throwing off Russian colonial domination. So there's a bit of tension there, but I think the short answer to your question is yes. I mean, I think the key question is: do Ukrainians feel that they've been dominated unfairly? Have Ukrainians experienced, colonial domination from Russia? And I think the answer is clearly they have.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what really interests me, and what really what felt, I of course grew up learning mostly about American history in school, about the Trail of Tears and how we moved off Native American people off of their land. That there is some reflection in the United States about that. Every Columbus Day that comes around, it becomes a hot topic in American media. What I've noticed, though, is that's not really as much of a hot topic in Russian society when it comes to, say, what happened to the Crimean population, the Tatars, or what happened to the Koreans that were, and some people consider ethnic cleansing, what happened to the Korean population that was moved during the Soviet period. Right. Do you think that part of the reason there is so, I guess, a little understanding of the Ukrainian perspective is just a failure of the Russian education system to include that? Or why do you think it's so difficult for Russians to see that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my view, clearly there has not been a real effort to do the kind of historical work in understanding these different phases and these different events. I mean,
there was some, though, when the archives opened up after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right. I mean, part of the reason the Ukrainians split off was after they revealed the full crimes of the Holodomor. It was what happened during that Soviet period. Do you think it was the closing of those archives?
Russia and Russian society at large has not really recognized that. Certainly the Ukrainians have recognized it, but as far as I know, there has been no effort on the part of the Russian educational system or Russian society to really acknowledge that. I mean, they will acknowledge that, oh, bad things happened, there was a famine, but they have yet to acknowledge that this was an invented famine that was imposed on Ukrainians as a method of control and collectivization. I mean, you'll still find people in the United States who will deny that actually happened, but I think the historical record is fairly clear on that. But yeah, and different societies have their own historical work to do. I mean, certainly, as you mentioned, the United States has a whole lot of work to do about the genocide of the Native Americans, the displacement of Native Americans, slavery, white supremacy. And a lot of countries, going back thousands and hundreds of years, have their own work to do. The Ukrainians have their own work to do as regards, the Holocaust, a huge portion of which took place in Ukraine. But I think when you go to a place like Babi Yar, when you go to some of these other places, you do see some of that historical work that's being done to kind of come to grips with that history. And I think the fact that Ukraine right now has a Jewish president is a bit of evidence that some of that work has really importantly been done.
What really surprised me is the just general reconciliation between Poland and Ukraine when it comes to the Ukrainian president visiting the sites of massacres that were committed by Ukrainian nationalists, and this type of reconciliation. I think it's been heavily sped up by the war.
No, I think that is right. As I wrote in my piece, I think the invasion just, from my experience of talking to people, just absolutely supercharged Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian identity on a whole range of things, in art, in culture, in restaurants, in just obviously in politics. But I think it has really, and I expect, and it's no surprise that we might see it in this kind of conception of like, okay, who are we as Ukrainians? What is our historical experience? What are our historical responsibilities to some of these events which took place in this land over the past 100+ years, and how do we need to educate ourselves about it to prepare for the future as an independent and sovereign country?
So I did want to ask, what was the main impression you got from your conversations with everyday Ukrainians? What they want from the United States and how they view the conflict as it's going right now?
Well, I mean, again, and I wrote this too, I mean, across the board, what I heard from folks was a strong belief that they need to get it all back. 100% of Ukraine, including Crimea. And a conversation I had with a group of local activists in Odessa really kind of crystallized it. It was, I mean, they feel like they have been witness to miracles. I mean, when they realized what was happening, first of all, a lot of people just didn't believe that the Russian invasion was really going to happen. They thought, how could something like this really happen? And all of a sudden it did. And they were terrified because the supposedly undefeatable or just huge, effective Russian war machine was going to roll over them. And all of a sudden it didn't. All of a sudden they were, the Russians were turned back from Kyiv. And then all of a sudden the Ukrainian army was, advancing in the counteroffensive, taking back some territory, but at the very least preventing the Russian military from moving across Ukraine. And they feel like they could never have imagined that their military would be capable of something like this. So they're like, we have seen miracles. We know that miracles can happen. And many people may not believe that we can take back all of Ukraine, but we know that that's a miracle that's coming. Now, people can disagree with that. They can say it's unrealistic. I have my own views. I think it may be unrealistic, but it is kind of a political fact that so many believe that is just, and I would agree it is just. I mean, according to international law, I mean, Ukraine, what it was in 1991 those are the borders of Ukraine, so it is entirely reasonable and just for Ukrainians to believe that they should get that all back. Whether it's feasible, whether there is an outcome short of that will turn out to be the one that leads to least harm is the conversation we should be having, though.
I think some people, when they talk about bringing the Ukrainians to the table to negotiate, they almost feel it's almost like, okay, come along now. Okay, time to get serious. Come along. We're going to sit you down. We're going to tell you what to say. We're going to tell you what to do. And it almost feels like we're making some of the same mistakes that we've made in the past. One of the main critiques I've heard from my Afghan friends and buddies that I know about the American pullout from Afghanistan wasn't even necessarily the fact that we pulled out. Many were against the pullout, some were in favor of pullout. But the main thing that they really despised was the fact that it was a negotiation between the United States and the Taliban, and the Afghan government wasn't even at the table. And so it feels like I'm watching a lot of people, and sometimes even progressives, turn into that same mentality, but with the Ukrainians, when they're determining the future of their country. I mean, millions of people displaced. Some people almost treat it like, oh, it's just changing a flag, when they don't realize exactly how bad occupation is until you hear the stories.
No, I totally agree with that. And as I write in the piece, I mean, even like saying, as I just did, that an outcome short of all of Ukraine might turn out to be the best one. I say that in full, acknowledgement what that would mean for Ukrainians continuing to live under areas of Russian control. I don't diminish that at all.
Yeah.
And
that was one of my questions was, what's your impression of Russian occupation?
Yeah, I mean, I will get to that in a second, but I want to answer your point about,
yes.
The idea that, and I've been very strongly against that because I think that's really important. At no point should we be seen to be negotiating over the heads of the Ukrainians or the Ukrainian government. And I actually think the Biden administration has actually handled this very well. They've constantly said, we will not be doing this. This is their land. This is their fight. And, this is what Putin wants. Putin wants to be in a negotiation with the United States. He sees Russia as a great power. And as a great power, Russia should not have to deal with whatever this little country wants. Russia should be dealing with other great powers like the United States. So Putin wants to negotiate the future of Ukraine with the government of the United States. And I think the Biden administration has quite rightly said, no, that's not going to happen. Now, having said that, ultimately, the United States and our allies in Europe are playing a huge role. We've been very, very engaged in supporting the defense of Ukraine at, in considerable cost to American taxpayers and others, acknowledging that the vast, majority of costs are paid by Ukrainians in their own blood and their own sweat. But still, I think we've been involved here to some extent where we can reasonably expect to have some influence on the outcome, because, the outcome matters to Ukraine first and foremost, but I think there are implications for Europe and for the world as to the outcome of this. So I think we do have interests here, but, so we can offer advice. We can even kind of offer firm advice. But again, I think, staying away from this idea that we're just going to solve this problem over the heads of the Ukrainians is something we shouldn't do. I think no country should accept that. And again, and one of the points I make in the piece is like, I appreciate how they're using this, they're making this point in Ukraine, and I wish they would take this concept seriously when it comes to the Palestinians, because the United States never seems to have any problem determining the fate of the Palestinians with people other than the Palestinians. But getting to what was your other question?
Russian occupation. I feel that a lot of people don't understand exactly what Russian occupation is, because sometimes they'll be like, Russians, Ukrainians, is like, yeah, they're just like switching a flag or whatever.
Yeah. No, I mean, just from what we've seen, the evidence that we've seen, the essentially kidnapping of children to send back into Russia to be, quote unquote, adopted by Russian families as part of a policy of, de-Ukrainizing and Russifying, whatever term you want to use, these areas of occupation. I mean, these are atrocities. I mean, I can't even imagine having my child stolen and sent thousands of miles away to a place I don't even know to be raised by people who I don't know and they don't know. And we've seen the treatment of Ukrainians in these areas that have been taken over. It is horrible. And like I said, we cannot diminish that. We have to acknowledge it. But I do think we also have to look and say, okay, if there's a situation in which Putin indicates that he is willing to, bring this war to a durable end, and I think that is a very key word. Durable. Not just let's have a ceasefire and give Putin time to reorganize when he can launch phase 2 and 3 of this war a year or 2 years from now. But if there is an opportunity to get to a real and durable end to this conflict, that leaves some Ukrainian territory under Russian control. I will not like that. Ukrainians certainly will not like that. But I think I think
the Kiev Institute of Sociology said, and this number shocked me, that 2 out of 3 Ukrainians would continue to say they should continue to fight even if all Western aid dries up. That is that is I don't know how to describe that, but such a deeply held belief by society.
I agree, and that reflects what I heard from folks in when I was there. And as I say in the piece, I mean, agreeing to such an outcome would be potentially, suicidal politically for any Ukrainian government.
I think I hate to interrupt you, but I do also want to say that a lot of people don't understand that what's currently occupied also is 80% of their coastline.
Yeah.
And as a major grain exporting nation, transporting these products by water is so much cheaper, like 9-10 times cheaper by rail. This is going to have, I mean, some Ukrainians that I talk to about, because they see the signaling that was talked about in the New York Times, they hear about it, and some of them say this could create a Ukrainian rump state.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. I mean, again, I'm really cautious about even floating the possibility. But again, I think what it really comes down to is if Putin shows any seriousness about negotiating an end to this war, which in my view, he has not yet. We see signals here and there. He might want to talk, and I think we should explore those. We should explore those, and I appreciate the Biden administration quietly has been keeping different channels open to look for these signals to see if they are real.
Back channels, yes.
Back channels, yes, while at the same time always making clear, like, to the Russian government and to Putin, we will not be negotiating this directly with you. This is something that the Ukrainians will negotiate with you, but we're happy to play some part of it. But I would just say, if there is a way to bring this war to a close in a way that is durable, it's something we would need to look seriously at if and when it ever happened.
Got you. So one or two more questions on Ukraine before I move over to Israel, which was the other part of the article, and I wanted to talk about comparing these two things. So I asked a Ukrainian friend, because when I interview public figures about Ukraine, I always try to make sure a Ukrainian at least gets to ask one of the questions. And he was very worried about a report that just came out about North Korean ballistic missiles being sent to Russia and now having been fired at Ukraine in these massive wave, largest air attack of the war. I've having a lot of my friends blow up my phone about them having to hide in corridors. Do you believe the United States is doing enough to support Ukraine from these types of air attacks? And the North Koreans, for example, and we're talking about Europe here, but they've sent, reportedly, according to South Koreans, 1 million shells to the North Koreans. Well, the Europeans so far have sent 480,000. And so there is a real fear in Ukraine about the lack of political will. And we're seeing this a lot, if they're going to mobilize their industry to truly support Ukraine's defense.
Yeah. I mean, are we doing enough? I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think we've sent a lot. I think from the Ukrainian perspective, more is always better. I think, in my view, and again, I write this in the piece, I think Biden has taken a fairly restrained approach, always being mindful of, the escalatory potential of new weapons and larger and more, expansive weapons and forms of support. And as tough as that is, I think for the Ukrainians, I do think that is wise, given that we are dealing with two nuclear powers here. I think the Europeans, I mean, they've given a lot kind of in terms of economic aid, but in terms of military aid, I think they all really do need to step this up. The question is, do we and they actually have the capacity to provide physically the amount of material that they might need potentially? I think the U.S., the kind of missile defenses that the U.S. has helped provide have done a really good job in protecting Kyiv. That was my understanding, having been there and talked to folks who were there. I mean, certainly not every city in the country has that kind of protection that the capital has. But I don't know how much of a game changer these new ballistic missiles could be. But as we've seen over the past few days, they could make a real change.
I know the Japanese are talking about sending more Patriot air defense systems through the United States, not systems, but the missiles through the United States to Ukraine. But it seems like to me that the United States plan is to expand artillery production enough that they can sustain Ukraine's M777 howitzer systems, American provided systems, as much as they can. Do you think that these investments in productive defense capacity to meet Ukraine's needs is important? And do you think more should be invested?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be enough. I would say probably more does need to be invested just to rebuild our own supply lines. But I'm also very cautious about, the way that, I've talked about this in a few different places. I don't really write about it in the piece, but, I'm someone who, spent a lot of time critiquing and certainly the work I did with Bernie questioning and challenging the military-industrial complex. I mean, the dominance of this, defense contractor, hawkish think tank complex, and the influence it has on the Washington policy debate is extraordinary, and it is destructive. And the challenge, I think, of at least the position, I think is, my view on Ukraine is like, I think it's good to support Ukraine's defense. I also recognize that this involves spending lots of money and giving lots of money to the military industrial complex. So is there a way to advance the goods of helping Ukraine defend itself in a way that does not simply reproduce and reinforce some of these really bad aspects of kind of U.S. global imperial military power? And one of the things I do write about in the piece is the challenge of making a case for Ukraine's defense that does not kind of help rehabilitate kind of neoconservative or kind of liberal interventionism that has done such enormous damage, not only to the world, but to our democracy and our society over the past 20 years in the global war on terror, and even before that, but particularly in the global war on terror. So I'm quite wary of those kind of consequences, while at the same time saying, yeah, I mean, we need to defend ourselves. We need sometimes to help our allies defend themselves, and that requires making more weapons.
I largely agree. I did want to ask quickly, though, when it comes to the air defense systems that we're providing Ukraine, is there any concern at all that if we were to stop providing this, if we were to completely stop providing these systems to Ukraine, if we were to stop providing more missile defense, is there any concern from the Republican Party, do you think, at this stage, if we were to just really freeze everything? Because right now it seems like they're the main stopping block.
Well, I mean, what you have is if it was just put to an up or down vote, I think this aid would pass. But the way it works is that the Republican majority in the House is so thin that you've got a small kind of, constituency of members who have the ability to block and extract and demand all kinds of things in exchange for their votes. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen. They've been holding up this aid. So, I think what we've seen of this current Republican Party and the current, the current Republicans in Congress is like, there's not a lot they won't do. Once they've decided that this is a way to screw with Democrats and a way to screw with Biden, screw the consequences, unfortunately.
So I wanted to touch on Israel quickly. I'm sorry this mostly dominated Ukraine, but, it's the issue that I specialize in, so I wanted to concentrate on that.
Let's talk about it.
I fear that American hypocrisy, or the system that we've helped beat, is going to be the undoing of the amount of influence we have in the international system. I fear that a lot of countries that are up and coming, especially what is traditionally considered the third world, even though I don't like that term, but it's what's usually referred to, are going to see America standing up for the international system in Ukraine, which the majority of countries supported. They voted in that way at the UN, even if they're not willing to put out their own necks to do it. Now seeing that hypocrisy fall in on itself when it comes to the sovereignty of the Palestinian people, which does not seem to be a priority from the American perspective in trying to deal with Israel in the after war and the after the fact when this war is over, or as the war is going on. This is something I've felt since the beginning of the Israeli invasion into Gaza, and I think your poise really articulated that. And I wanted to compliment you on the piece for that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree 100% with everything you just said. I'm really concerned about that. As I write, I think Biden and his team laid out a really important set of principles for why it was important for the U.S. to help defend Ukraine. They laid out a vision of, or at least promoted a set of, an idea of a rules-based order. And then they spent the last 3 months burning that all to the ground. They showed that when it's being done by a country that we like, a lot of these things, like, just obliterating entire cities, cutting off food and water and electricity to civilian populations, things that were just straightforwardly called terrorism when Russia was doing it to Ukrainians, all of a sudden seem permissible when the Israeli military is doing this to Palestinians in Gaza. And again, none of this is to defend or justify or downplay the atrocities of October 7. No one should do that. I'm not doing that. I insist that we acknowledge that was just barbaric beyond imagining. But there is, there is a deeper context here. As I write in the piece, history did not begin on October 7. And regardless of how brutal October 7 was, that does not then give Israel or any country permission to just blatantly violate, international humanitarian law with regard to the protection of civilians. And that, in my view, is clearly what we've been seeing for the past 3 months with the continued and unconditional backing of the Biden administration. I think that it's hugely damaging.
Something that I was worried about, and I felt it right after October 7th. I was very young when 9/11 happened. I couldn't feel it, but I can look back and watch the Howard Stern show and get an idea of what it was like in the immediate aftermath, right?
Yeah.
I'm worried that some of this operation is based in the fact that you have to do something. And when I talk to people, when I talk to Israelis, I get that impression a lot. Like, we have to do something. What happened was so awful. Something has to be done. And this is something. And my question would be, and this will be the last question we wrap up on, what would you say to Israelis who say, well, something has to be done? Yeah. Like, do you reward these people with a peace with a state? Is at least the counter argument I hear often to backing the Netanyahu government's campaign in Gaza?
Yeah, no, of course you have to do something. Israel has the right and responsibility to defend its people. Any country does. You don't have to do this. I mean, you don't have to just turn, the largest city in Palestine into a ruin. You don't have to make 2 million people refugees. Certainly, you need to go after the people who planned and carried out the attack. There are ways to do that. I mean, listen, as we saw in Beirut, when Israel wants to, it can hit a guy with fairly limited civilian casualties. It is not choosing to do that in Gaza. So again, I certainly recognize the kind of political realities and the outrage and the trauma and the support among the vast majority of Israelis for responding, and I sympathize with that. I empathize with what they're going through. I certainly experienced it in that kind of outrage and trauma in response to 9/11. And let's recognize what we did was way, way worse. And we obliterated far more than just Gaza in response to 9/11. So I say this with humility as an American, but I also think it's important. I mean, it is interesting to me how this kind of empathy is almost never shown to Palestinians who have been enduring a more than 50-year occupation, a daily reality of violence and humiliation and harassment day after day after day. And if we're going to say, well, they needed to do something, it is very easy for me to see that from the Palestinian side as well. We need to do something to respond to this brutality that is imposed on us every single day. And again, that is not a defense of October 7 any more than it's a defense of Israel's, massacre in Gaza. But I just, I think it is important to understand that this argument goes both ways.
Thank you so much for coming on today's stream. Is there anything people can go to check out, from any article you would want people to read or anything you want people to check out?
No, I mean, you can check my Twitter feed at Matt Duss. And I just want to thank you for inviting me, and thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. You have a great one. Okay, man?
All right. You too, man.
Awesome. Bye-bye.